The new beginning. Elijah's heart raced as he gazed out the window of the family car, watching the world change as they drove farther from the city. The streets grew wider, the buildings taller and more polished, the signs more uniform and neat. The hustle and bustle of the urban life he had known was slowly replaced by the quiet, ordered serenity of Maple Ridge. It was an unfamiliar landscape, one that didn't feel quite like home. But it was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance for a new life, away from the struggles that had defined his past. Maple Ridge wasn't like the cramped city apartments Elijah had grown up in, where every day felt like survival, where his family had learned to make do with what they had, even if that meant facing prejudice at every turn. It wasn't like the alleyways and street corners where he and his friends would hang out, keeping their heads low to avoid trouble. No, this was supposed to be a different world. The streets were cleaner, the houses larger, and there was a sense of calm that Elijah found both comforting and unsettling. A peacefulness that didn't quite feel like peace. He glanced over at his younger brother, Marcus, whose eyes were wide with excitement as they approached their new home, a large, two-story house with a sprawling front yard. Marcus had always been the optimistic one, ready to take on anything that came their way. But Elijah? He was more cautious, more aware of the quiet tension that seemed to hang in the air. The family had made this move for a reason. His parents had talked about opportunity, about giving them a chance to succeed in a neighborhood where they could thrive. But Elijah knew that the real challenge lay ahead. They parked in the driveway, and as Elijah stepped out of the car, he was immediately struck by the silence that surrounded him. There was no bustling street corner, no distant sirens, no music or conversations drifting from nearby apartments. Just quiet. And the eyes. The neighbors, who had been watching from their windows, didn't waste any time. Elijah could feel their eyes on him, curious, assessing, perhaps even judgmental. It wasn't an outright hostile stare, but there was something in the way they looked at him that made him feel as if he didn't belong. His mother, sensing his unease, put a hand on his shoulder. "It's going to be okay, Elijah," she said, trying to reassure him. "We're here for a reason." Elijah forced a smile, but the words didn't ease the knot in his stomach. He had been the only black student in his last school, a fact that had made him a target for bullying. He had gotten used to it, dealing with the whispers behind his back, the insults, the occasional shoving, but it never made it any easier. He had hoped that a fresh start would change things, but deep down, he wondered if this new place would be any different. He carried his backpack inside and set it down on the kitchen table. The smell of fresh paint and new carpet filled the air. The house was nice, much bigger than their old one, and everything seemed so perfect. But perfection, Elijah knew, was often just a surface. Beneath it, there could be all kinds of things lurking. After a few moments, his mother called for him to help with the boxes. As they unpacked, Elijah couldn't help but notice the houses across the street, the way the windows were always drawn shut, the way people seemed to avoid eye contact when they passed by. The town felt cold in a way that made him feel even more out of place. Later that afternoon, as Elijah took a walk to clear his mind, he saw something that almost made him forget his worries. A small park at the end of the block, its swings swaying gently in the breeze, a few kids scattered around the playground. A sense of nostalgia washed over him. Maybe, just maybe, this could work out. Maybe he'd find a way to fit in, to make friends who didn't care about the color of his skin. But as he walked closer, he saw a group of kids gathered under the large oak tree in the middle of the park. They were laughing and joking, throwing a football back and forth. Elijah stopped in his tracks when he recognized one of them, Jason Cooper, the son of the local sheriff. Jason had been at his new school for only a few days, but Elijah already knew enough about him. Jason wasn't the type of kid who was going to welcome him with open arms. Elijah had encountered kids like Jason before, kids who thought their status, their family name, made them better than others. And he had learned that the best thing to do was avoid them. So, he kept his distance, watching from the sidewalk as Jason and his friends exchanged taunts and jokes. It didn't take long for Jason to spot him. "Well, look who decided to join us." "The city kid," Jason called out, a smirk spreading across his face. His friends snickered, and Elijah's stomach tightened. He wanted to keep walking, to ignore them, but Jason's voice was too loud to pretend it didn't hurt. "What's up, new kid?" Jason continued, stepping closer. "Got a lot of big plans for this place? Or are you just here to mess things up like all the others?" Elijah's fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the way they judged him without even knowing him. It was nothing new, but it still stung. He wanted to say something, to fight back, but he knew that getting into a confrontation with Jason wouldn't solve anything. His best bet was to walk away, to pretend it didn't matter. Without responding, Elijah turned and walked back down the street, his heart pounding in his chest. It felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on him, the weight of expectations, of assumptions, of a life that he didn't ask for. When he got back home, his mother could tell something was wrong. "How was your walk, Elijah?" she asked, her voice soft. "It was fine," Elijah replied, trying to hide the frustration in his tone. "Just met some people from the school. They're not very friendly." His mother sighed. "I know it's hard, sweetheart. But we're here to build something better. This is our chance to make a real home." Elijah didn't say anything. Instead, he went to his room and closed the door. He sat on the edge of his bed, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that he had to deal with prejudice again, or the feeling that he would never truly belong here. The silence in the neighborhood felt suffocating. He longed for the noise, the chaos of the city. At least there, he knew who his enemies were. But here, in this pristine, quiet place, he wasn't sure if the real enemy was the kids at school, or the place itself. He lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. Then, he heard something outside his window. A soft noise, a rustle in the bushes. He sat up, curious. His gaze fell on an elderly woman in her front yard, standing with a cane in her hand. She was looking up at a light fixture above her porch, squinting and poking at it with her cane, clearly frustrated. She didn't seem to notice Elijah watching her from the window. Something in her struggle tugged at his heart. Despite all the new faces, all the challenges ahead, he could still find a way to help. And for the first time since they arrived, Elijah felt a spark of purpose. A changed perspective. The morning after helping Mrs. Penelope with the light, Elijah woke up with a strange sense of anticipation. As he got ready for school, he found himself strangely hopeful. It wasn't a feeling he was used to. He had helped someone, done something kind, and it hadn't been for any reward or recognition. He had simply seen someone in need and chosen to help. In a place that had so far felt cold and indifferent, it was a small victory. He couldn't quite shake the memory of the elderly woman's warm smile when she thanked him, the quiet gratitude in her voice. As he walked to school, his mind drifted back to her house. He had offered a simple service, something so small compared to the grand scheme of things. Yet, in his heart, it had meant more than he cared to admit. There was a connection there, however fleeting. He didn't know why, but something about that moment with Mrs. Penelope had given him a glimmer of hope. Walking through the school gates, however, that optimism quickly vanished. The familiar faces greeted him with the same coldness he had come to expect, and the usual whispers started again. He made his way to the courtyard, trying to keep his head down. The place was buzzing with the energy of teenagers, some laughing in groups, others sitting alone, lost in their own worlds. But Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Jason Cooper and his friends were already there, standing in their usual circle. Jason caught sight of Elijah from across the courtyard, and a wide grin spread across his face. Elijah could almost hear the mocking thoughts forming behind that smirk. He knew what was coming next. Jason was like a hawk, always looking for the next person to target, always ready to swoop in with his cruel words. Elijah had learned long ago that it was better to ignore him, to simply keep moving and not let it get under his skin. But today, for reasons he couldn't quite understand, Elijah didn't walk away. "Hey, look who's here," Jason called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard. The laughter from his friends followed, a chorus of snickers and jeers. "You know, I heard you were helping out the old lady down the street. You trying to be her little hero or something?" Elijah stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what to say. Was this just more of Jason's usual bullying? Or was there something else behind it? He hesitated for a moment, feeling his palms start to sweat. "I helped her with her light," Elijah said slowly, trying to keep his voice steady. Jason's eyes narrowed. "That right? And what did she give you for it? A pat on the back? Maybe a cookie?" Elijah clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He could feel the anger rising within him, threatening to spill over. It was all too familiar. The way Jason and his friends thought they were superior, the way they used their words like weapons. But Elijah had learned to swallow his pride, to bite his tongue. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. "I didn't do it for anything," Elijah replied, his voice quieter now. "I just helped her because it was the right thing to do." Jason's smile faded for a moment, replaced by a sneer. "Right thing to do, huh? You really think you belong here, don't you? Helping out old people and thinking they're gonna like you? Guess what, Elijah? This isn't your world. You don't fit in here." The words cut deep, more than Elijah cared to admit. The truth was, Jason was right about one thing: Elijah didn't fit in. He never had. And as much as he wanted to prove otherwise, the reality was that the world around him seemed to confirm every stereotype, every prejudice, that he'd always fought against. The people in this town weren't like the ones in the city. They didn't understand him, and they didn't want to. No matter how much he tried to fit in, no matter how much he helped others, it was never enough. As Jason and his friends continued to mock him, Elijah stood there in silence, fighting the urge to lash out. He turned away from the group, walking toward the school building, his thoughts spiraling. It wasn't just Jason. It was everyone. The way they looked at him, the way they judged him before they even knew his name. The subtle racism in the air, the undercurrent of suspicion that ran through everything. Elijah could feel it everywhere he went. It was in the way the teachers looked at him, the way the other students avoided him, the way they assumed he wasn't worth their time. It was exhausting. Every day felt like a battle he couldn't win. As the school day went on, Elijah tried to focus on his classes. He was good at math, had always been good at it. Numbers were predictable, logical, things he could control. But even in the classroom, it felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. The teacher called on him once or twice, but his answers came out forced, as if the words didn't belong to him. By the time the final bell rang, signaling the end of the day, Elijah was exhausted. It was as if every ounce of energy had been drained from him. He just wanted to go home, to escape the world outside. But as he stepped into the parking lot, he saw something that caught his attention. Across the street, Mrs. Penelope stood outside her house again, staring up at the same light. It had gone out again, the bulb flickering weakly as she poked at it with her cane. The sight of her struggling brought a strange sense of calm to Elijah. He didn't know why, but something about the way she stood there, determined to fix it on her own despite her age, reminded him of his own fight. The battle against everything that sought to bring him down. Maybe she wasn't so different from him after all. Elijah took a deep breath, ignoring the voice in his head that warned him to stay away. This wasn't just about the light anymore. It was about something bigger, about standing up against the odds, even when the world seemed to be telling you no. He crossed the street without hesitation this time, his footsteps firm as he approached Mrs. Penelope. "Need some help?" he called out, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. She turned, her wrinkled face lighting up in recognition. "Oh, Elijah. You're back. I thought you might be too busy to help an old lady out again." "Nope, I'm here," Elijah said, trying to push past the frustration of the day. "Let me give you a hand with that light." He grabbed the ladder from her shed and set it up, just as he had done the day before. As he climbed up to reach the light, Mrs. Penelope's voice came from below. "You're a good boy, Elijah. Not many people would go out of their way to help someone like me. Especially not in this neighborhood." Elijah hesitated for a moment as he twisted the bulb into place, the weight of her words sinking in. "I'm just trying to do what's right," he replied quietly, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "Sometimes," she said softly, "doing the right thing is all we can do. The world may not appreciate it, but that doesn't make it any less important." As Elijah finished fixing the light, he looked down at Mrs. Penelope, who was smiling up at him. For the first time that day, he felt like he wasn't alone. There was something comforting about her presence, something reassuring. He hadn't realized how much he needed that until now. "Thanks again, Elijah," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You've got a good heart. Don't let the world tell you otherwise." Elijah nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. It was a simple exchange, but it meant everything to him. Maybe the world didn't want him here. Maybe it was full of people like Jason, who would always try to tear him down. But Mrs. Penelope had reminded him of something important: kindness, integrity, and doing the right thing, no matter how hard it seemed, were worth fighting for. Tensions rise. The next few days felt like a blur. Elijah couldn't shake the events that had unfolded since the encounter with Mrs. Penelope. The kindness he had shown her, even in the face of such a hostile environment, seemed like a small victory in a place that constantly reminded him that he wasn't welcome. But the deeper he got into his routine, the more he realized that no matter how much he helped, no matter how much he did the right thing, there were forces beyond his control trying to tear him down. School felt unbearable, the halls lined with stares and whispers. Every time he walked past Jason and his friends, he could feel their eyes on him, their words ready to strike. It was as if they had some unwritten rule: Elijah didn't belong. He had to be put in his place. Jason's taunts had escalated. At first, it had been little things: throwing paper airplanes at him during class, making crude remarks when he walked by, trying to provoke him into a fight. But now, it felt different. Every time Jason spoke to him, it was laced with something darker, something more sinister. The taunts were no longer just jokes, they were threats disguised as humor. On the fourth day after the light incident, the tension hit its peak. Elijah had been sitting in his history class, trying to focus on the teacher's lecture, when a piece of paper landed on his desk. He glanced at it cautiously, wondering if it was another one of Jason's childish pranks. But when he unfolded the note, his heart sank. "You're nothing but a charity case, Elijah. Just remember, you don't belong here. We know who you really are." The words were chilling, their meaning clear. They weren't just mocking him for being black. They were threatening him, attempting to strip him of whatever semblance of dignity he had left. Elijah felt his hands tremble, but he quickly folded the paper and shoved it into his pocket. He knew better than to react, he couldn't give them the satisfaction. He wasn't about to let Jason or anyone else see how much it hurt. But deep down, he knew things were getting worse. Jason was more than just a bully now, he was a symbol of everything Elijah had come to fear in this town, the pervasive, unspoken racism that haunted the community. It wasn't just about jokes or insults anymore. It was about power, control, and the kind of people who believed they could dictate who belonged and who didn't. That afternoon, as Elijah made his way out of the school, he felt the familiar weight of the world on his shoulders. The courtyard was crowded with students, most of them in their cliques, laughing and chatting as though nothing mattered. Jason was hanging out with his friends, leaning against a wall near the exit, eyes scanning the crowd. When he saw Elijah, his lips curled into that same knowing smirk. "Hey, Elijah," Jason called out, his voice loud enough to carry through the courtyard. His friends looked on with amusement, waiting for the next round of humiliation to begin. Elijah tried to keep his head down, but it was no use. Jason had a way of drawing everyone's attention, making sure that every move Elijah made was scrutinized. "You're really gonna act like you belong here?" Jason's voice dripped with disdain. "We all know what kind of people you are." The crowd quieted, the silence a heavy pressure around Elijah's chest. He could feel all their eyes on him, waiting for him to respond, to break. But Elijah didn't give in. He swallowed the lump in his throat and kept walking, his eyes fixed on the ground in front of him. "Walk away, Elijah," Jason taunted, a sneer forming as he stepped closer. "It's the only thing you're good at." As Elijah passed, Jason took a step forward and shoved him. It wasn't hard, but it was enough to send Elijah stumbling. The laughter from the crowd erupted, and Elijah's anger flared. It wasn't just about Jason anymore. It was about everything, about all the years of being overlooked, of being told he wasn't good enough, of being forced to live in a world that refused to see him as anything more than a stereotype. He turned, fists clenched at his sides. For a moment, he could hear the voice in his head, the voice that told him to fight back. To show Jason and everyone else that he wasn't weak. But as Elijah looked at Jason's smug face, he realized something important: giving in to violence wasn't the answer. It never had been. Instead, he chose to walk away. The crowd's laughter echoed behind him, but Elijah kept his head high. He had nothing to prove. He didn't need to stoop to their level. As he walked home, his thoughts spun in circles. How much longer could he keep this up? How many more days of walking with his head down, avoiding confrontation, would it take before he lost himself completely? The sky was overcast, the wind picking up as the sun started to dip below the horizon. Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, that the tension building in him and in the world around him would eventually boil over. The question was, what would happen then? Would it be the same as it always had been, just another moment where he was forced to keep quiet and accept the way things were? Or would this time be different? When he reached Mrs. Penelope's house again, the light was on, finally working. He could see her sitting on the porch in the rocking chair, a knitted blanket draped over her lap. She was watching the street, her eyes scanning the neighborhood with a kind of quiet wisdom that Elijah had come to admire. He stood across the street for a moment, unsure if he should approach. The memory of their last conversation, the kindness in her voice, played in his mind. He had helped her, and in return, she had offered him more than just thanks. She had given him perspective. Maybe he wasn't alone in this fight. As Elijah crossed the street, Mrs. Penelope noticed him and waved. He smiled faintly in return, walking slowly toward her porch. "Hey, Elijah," she said warmly. "How's school going?" Elijah hesitated. It's not great," he admitted. "There's a lot of tension. People aren't exactly welcoming." She nodded slowly, her expression serious but kind. "I can imagine. You're a good boy, Elijah. You've got a big heart, and that's something that's rare these days. Don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong." "I'm trying," Elijah said softly, sitting down on the porch step beside her. "But sometimes it feels like I don't even know who I'm fighting anymore. It's like no matter what I do, I'm always the outsider. I don't fit in here." Mrs. Penelope smiled gently, her wrinkled hands resting on her lap. "Maybe that's because you're not supposed to fit in. Maybe you're here to make a difference, even if that difference is just a little light in the darkness. Don't worry about fitting in, Elijah. Worry about being true to who you are. Elijah felt something shift inside him, a small but powerful change. The world might not accept him, but that didn't mean he couldn't carve out a place for himself. It wasn't about fitting into their world, it was about building his own. As the wind rustled the leaves in the trees and the streetlights flickered on one by one, Elijah realized that perhaps Mrs. Penelope was right. Maybe his place wasn't here in the way he had imagined. Maybe it was here in a way he hadn't yet figured out. But whatever happened next, Elijah knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. Unseen struggles. The following days passed in a haze. Elijah had learned to expect the worst when he walked into school each morning, but there was something different now. A quiet shift in the air. The bullying hadn't stopped, not by a long shot, but there was something about the way he was beginning to carry himself that made the torment feel less sharp. It wasn't that he was any less affected by it, far from it, but there was a subtle change in the way he responded. Instead of crumbling inwardly, Elijah began to develop a quiet resilience, a strength that came not from fighting back, but from enduring, and perhaps, understanding that his worth wasn't defined by those who sought to tear him down. But on that particular Thursday, something happened that Elijah had never expected. As he trudged through the hallway between classes, trying to keep his eyes straight ahead, he was stopped by Mrs. Glover, the school guidance counselor. Her presence was comforting, her soft eyes kind but perceptive. Elijah had seen her a few times before, but they had never spoken much beyond the formalities of student-teacher interaction. "Elijah," she called, walking toward him. Her voice was warm, yet there was an edge of concern that caught him off guard. "Could I have a moment of your time?" He froze for a second, unsure of what to say. He didn't know if he was ready to face another adult trying to help him with his problems, the ones they couldn't possibly understand. But there was something in Mrs. Glover's voice that felt different, more genuine. "Sure," he said cautiously, his voice low. They moved toward her office, a small room in the corner of the school with calming colors on the walls and a single, large window that let in streams of light. Mrs. Glover gestured for him to sit across from her desk as she made her way around to her chair. "Elijah," she began, sitting down, "I've been hearing some things from the teachers. About your work. You're an exceptional student. But I'm worried about you. How are you really doing?" Elijah couldn't quite meet her eyes. He hadn't been ready for this. He hadn't prepared for anyone to ask about his real feelings, especially not in such a direct way. His usual response was to hide, to withdraw into himself, to keep his struggles to a minimum. But something about her question made it hard to maintain the wall he had so carefully built. "I'm fine," he lied, a weak smile tugging at his lips. Mrs. Glover leaned forward, her gaze kind but unrelenting. "You don't have to lie to me, Elijah. I know what it's like. I know it can't be easy for you right now." She paused, her voice dropping to a soft whisper. "I'm not blind. I see the way people treat you." Elijah felt his throat tighten. He hadn't realized that the adults around him noticed, he hadn't known anyone was paying that much attention. The idea of his pain being acknowledged by others, especially by someone who wasn't his mother or family, was a strange relief, but also a burden. His whole life had been shaped by his desire to remain invisible, to keep his hurt to himself. But now, Mrs. Glover was giving him the space to express it. A part of him wanted to run, to shut her out, but another part of him, the part that longed to be seen, wanted to spill everything out. He began, but the words were caught in his throat. How could he explain what was happening without sounding like he was complaining? How could he express what he'd been feeling without looking weak or vulnerable? He had spent so long holding it all in that the idea of speaking up now felt foreign, almost impossible. Mrs. Glover waited patiently, her gaze understanding. "You don't have to say anything right now. But I want you to know that you don't have to carry this burden alone. You're not invisible to me, Elijah. You matter. And you're not just here to exist, you're here to make an impact, even if you don't see it yet. Elijah looked up at her, her words washing over him. She was the first person in a long time to speak to him with such openness, without pity or judgment. Her words stirred something in him that he hadn't realized was there, a flicker of hope, however small. I know it's hard, she continued, her voice softening, but don't let the way others see you define who you are. People will try to put labels on you, Elijah. They'll try to tell you who you are, who you're supposed to be. But none of that matters unless you believe it. You've got more power than you think. Elijah didn't know what to say. His mind was still whirling from her words. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that he had some greater purpose beyond just surviving. But the constant weight of rejection, the daily reminders that he was different, made it so hard to imagine anything better. I don't know if I can, he finally whispered, his voice barely audible. You don't have to know yet, Mrs. Glover said gently. Just take it one day at a time. I'm here for you, Elijah. If you need someone to talk to, you don't have to go through it alone. For the first time in days, Elijah felt a small sense of relief. She wasn't offering him empty promises or platitudes, she was giving him something more tangible, the space to be himself, to speak his truth, and the assurance that someone, at least one person, cared. As he left her office, the bell for the next class rang, but Elijah couldn't quite shake the feeling that something inside him had shifted. Mrs. Glover had made him feel seen, made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as invisible as he had once thought. When he stepped outside the school and into the cold afternoon air, Elijah could see the familiar group of students hanging around the entrance, laughing, joking, and waiting for the buses. Jason was there too, leaning against the wall, his gaze catching Elijah's as he approached. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and Elijah could feel the weight of Jason's judgment on him. But this time, he didn't look away. This time, he didn't let the sneer that curled on Jason's lips affect him the way it once had. Elijah straightened his shoulders and walked past, his head held high. He was tired of being afraid. He was tired of allowing others to dictate his worth. Maybe it wasn't much, maybe it was just a small shift, but in that moment, Elijah made a decision. He wasn't going to let anyone, especially Jason, take away his sense of self. As he walked toward Mrs. Penelope's house, the sense of calm he had felt in her presence earlier that week returned. She wasn't the only person who believed in him now. Mrs. Glover had shown him that there were people who could see him for who he was, not just the color of his skin or the weight of his struggles. And that made all the difference. A change in the air. The days that followed were not perfect. In fact, they were far from it. The weight of being a target in school remained ever present, and the quiet whispers of classmates continued to echo in Elijah's mind. But something had shifted in him. A small spark had been lit by Mrs. Glover's words, by the kind acknowledgement of Mrs. Penelope, and by the growing resolve within him that he wasn't going to let himself be crushed under the weight of the neighborhood's rejection. That evening, as Elijah sat at the kitchen table, the sounds of his family's dinner conversation filled the room. His parents were talking about the upcoming weekend, how they hoped to visit a nearby park, how they wanted to take a break from the routine and just be together. But Elijah could barely focus on their words, his thoughts swirling back to the events of the past week, to the strange mix of kindness and cruelty he had encountered. "Everything okay, son?" His father's voice broke through the haze of his thoughts. "You seem a little distant tonight." Elijah glanced up from his plate. His father's expression was filled with genuine concern, but Elijah wasn't sure how to explain what he was feeling. How could he talk about the weight of racism, of feeling like an outsider, without burdening his family even more? They already had their struggles. His father worked long hours at the factory, and his mother juggled multiple jobs to keep the household afloat. The last thing they needed was for Elijah to add more stress to their already heavy plates. "I'm fine," Elijah said with a forced smile, pushing his food around on his plate. Just tired from school, I guess. His father nodded, but his gaze lingered a little longer than usual. You know you can talk to us if you need to, right? About anything. Elijah nodded. He knew they cared, he really did. But there was something about the distance he felt from the rest of the world that made him hesitant to share too much. His parents couldn't protect him from the things that were happening at school, from the way people looked at him or whispered behind his back. They couldn't shield him from the feeling of being out of place, no matter how much they loved him. After dinner, Elijah retreated to his room, the familiar feeling of isolation settling over him once again. He opened the window and let the cool night air fill the room, the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of leaves the only sounds breaking the silence. It was during these moments, when he was alone with his thoughts, that the true weight of everything seemed to hit him. How long could he keep up this charade of being okay? How long before the quiet torment of school wore him down completely? The next day, as he walked to school, he caught sight of Jason and his friend standing by the entrance, laughing in their usual way. Elijah knew better than to make eye contact, to let them see how much their words affected him. But as he walked past, he heard Jason's voice, loud and clear, cutting through the morning air. Look at him, Jason sneered. Thinks he's too good for this place. He doesn't belong here. The words stung, but Elijah didn't flinch. He kept his head high, walking past the group without acknowledging them. The taunts continued behind him, but he didn't turn back. He had learned to ignore them, to pretend they weren't there. It was hard, but it was better than letting them see how much they hurt. The day dragged on in its usual pattern. Teachers taught, students talked, and the rhythm of high school life continued. But for Elijah, everything felt off. The moments of quiet isolation seemed to stretch longer and longer, and the weight of his difference felt heavier with each passing minute. During lunch, as he sat by himself in the cafeteria, a shadow fell over his table. Elijah looked up, half expecting it to be one of Jason's friends come to torment him further. But instead, it was Mrs. Penelope. She was standing in front of him, smiling warmly, holding a small container in her hands. Mind if I join you, Elijah? She asked gently, her voice as calming as always. Elijah blinked in surprise. Mrs. Penelope had never come into the school before. He hadn't even expected her to stop by. But there she was, as steady and kind as ever. Of course, he said, his voice a little hoarse from the shock of seeing her. But, what are you doing here? Mrs. Penelope chuckled lightly, sitting down across from him. Well, I was on my way to the grocery store, and I thought I'd drop by to see how you were doing. You've been on my mind, Elijah. I wanted to make sure you were holding up okay. Elijah didn't know how to respond to that. Mrs. Penelope's kindness had always been a balm for his spirit, but now, it felt like a lifeline. Here was someone who truly cared about him, who wasn't afraid to reach out even when things were difficult. I'm hanging in there, Elijah said quietly, his eyes avoiding hers for a moment. It's just hard, you know? Some days it feels like I'm invisible, like nothing I do matters. Like I don't even belong here. Mrs. Penelope's smile softened, her eyes kind but knowing. I understand, Elijah. More than you might realize. But I want you to remember something. You matter. You always have, and you always will. No one can take that away from you. The words were simple, but they hit Elijah harder than anything else had in a long time. The weight of his struggles, the constant sense of isolation, all of it seemed to dissipate just a little bit in that moment. Maybe he didn't belong in the way the world expected, but that didn't mean he didn't have value. That didn't mean he couldn't make a difference. He didn't know how or when things would get better. He didn't know how he could face the days ahead, knowing the kinds of people who wanted to tear him down. But in that moment, sitting across from Mrs. Penelope, Elijah realized that maybe belonging wasn't about fitting into a place, it was about finding the people who saw him for who he was, who believed in him even when he couldn't believe in himself. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Mrs. Penelope stood, a knowing smile on her face. "I'll let you get back to class," she said. "But remember what I said, Elijah. You're not invisible. You're more important than you realize." As she walked away, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. Maybe he wasn't going to change the world overnight, and maybe he wasn't going to make everything perfect. But with each act of kindness, with each step forward, he was beginning to carve out a space for himself in a world that had tried so hard to make him small. And that, Elijah realized, was a victory in itself. The strength within. The next few weeks felt like a whirlwind. School was no easier, the weight of the bullying never quite lifting, but something within Elijah had changed. Every morning when he left the house, he could feel the lingering sting of the words from the previous day, but instead of retreating into the shadows, he began to stand taller. It wasn't that the taunts and insults didn't bother him anymore, they still cut deep, but now, Elijah was learning to stand in the face of it, to let the words wash over him without letting them define who he was. The whispers in the hallways continued, the sidelong glances still there, but now, he wore them like a badge of honor. The people who hated him, who judged him based on his skin color or the neighborhood he lived in, were the ones who were truly blind. They couldn't see his heart, couldn't see his potential. And in that realization, Elijah found a small but powerful strength. The hardest part, though, wasn't the school. It wasn't the kids who jeered at him or the teachers who turned a blind eye. It was the feeling of being an outsider in his own home. His parents were busy, his father working late nights and his mother juggling multiple shifts, and while they were loving and supportive, they couldn't truly understand the complexities of the world Elijah was navigating. They couldn't understand what it felt like to be the only black kid in a sea of faces that looked nothing like his own. But Mrs. Glover's words echoed in his mind. "You're not invisible. You matter." And he began to believe her. He started to find his voice, not just in the world outside, but in his own home as well. It wasn't easy, it never was, but the more he fought to make himself heard, the more he realized that he wasn't alone. He had people in his life who cared for him, who believed in him. And for the first time in a long time, he was starting to believe in himself. One afternoon, Elijah found himself sitting in Mrs. Penelope's living room. Her kindness had become a safe haven, a place where he could let down his guard and just be himself. She was older, her hair graying at the temples, but there was a spark in her eyes that made her seem young at heart. She had become a second grandmother to him, always offering advice, always listening when he needed to talk. "Elijah," she said one afternoon, her voice soft but firm. "There's a way you can make your voice heard. You don't have to just take everything that's thrown at you. You're stronger than you know." Elijah looked up from the cup of tea he had been stirring, his eyes full of questions. "What do you mean?" She smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "I mean that sometimes, Elijah, you have to fight back, not with anger, not with violence, but with your actions, with your choices. You can make a difference in ways that others can't even imagine. You just have to believe in the power of what you do." Her words stirred something in him. What if she was right? What if he could make a change, even if it was just in small ways? What if, instead of retreating or fighting back in the same way his tormentors did, he could stand tall and fight for what was right, by showing others that he had value, that he had something worth sharing? The next day, Elijah walked to school with a new purpose. He had been walking the same path, in the same subdued way, for so long that he barely noticed the people around him anymore. But today was different. Today, he was going to let his actions speak for him. He wasn't going to shrink away from the bullies. He wasn't going to let them define who he was. Instead, he would make them see, by standing firm in who he was and by doing the right thing, no matter how difficult. The moment he stepped into the schoolyard, he saw Jason and his friends laughing, waiting by the entrance. Jason's eyes immediately landed on him, the familiar sneer curling up at the corners of his mouth. "Elijah, you're still here?" Jason's voice was laced with mockery, his friends snickering behind him. But this time, Elijah didn't feel the need to retreat. He stood tall, facing Jason directly, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what was coming, he knew the words, the insults, the cruelty, but he wasn't going to let it break him. "Not today. I'm here because I belong here," Elijah said, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. "And I'm not going anywhere." The words were simple, but they felt like a declaration. He wasn't going to let them drive him out. He wasn't going to shrink in fear. For the first time in a long time, Elijah stood firm, unwavering, unbroken. Jason's sneer faltered, just for a moment. His friends exchanged confused glances, unsure how to react to Elijah's calm, confident stance. For a brief second, the bullying seemed to lose its power. But Jason quickly recovered, trying to regain control of the situation. "Whatever, Elijah. You'll never fit in here. You'll always be different." Elijah's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Maybe that's true. But it doesn't matter. I'm not here to fit in. I'm here to be me." And with that, he turned and walked into the school building, feeling the weight of their stares behind him but not letting them reach him. He wasn't going to be broken. Not by Jason, not by anyone. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. Elijah was walking through the halls when he overheard a group of students talking. At first, he thought it was more of the usual gossip, the usual cruelty. But then he heard a name he didn't expect to hear. "Elijah's not so bad," one of the students said. "I've seen him around. He doesn't let people mess with him. I respect that." Another student nodded. "Yeah, he's different. He doesn't try to change who he is. He doesn't act all fake just to fit in." Elijah paused, his heart racing. The words caught him off guard. People were noticing him, and not for the reasons he had feared. They were seeing him for who he was, not for the things that made him different. He didn't know if it would last, if people would come around or if they'd fall back into their old ways. But in that moment, Elijah realized something important. Change didn't happen overnight, but every small act of courage, every step toward being himself, was a victory. He was showing the world that he could stand tall, that he wasn't just going to survive, he was going to thrive. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.